The city bustled under the late afternoon sun, its streets alive with the rhythm of daily life. Cars honked, pedestrians crossed intersections, and street vendors called out their wares. Among the chaos, Maya, a poised black woman in her late 40s, hurriedly navigated the crowded sidewalks. She wasn't dressed in her usual courtroom attire. Instead, she wore simple jeans and a blouse, her hair tied back in a loose bun. It was one of those rare days when she could step away from her high-profile life as a federal judge and focus on personal matters, specifically, helping her elderly mother with errands. Her day had started unremarkably. A quick breakfast, a few phone calls to clear her schedule, and then the drive to pick up her mother, a spirited woman with an endless list of things to do. They had spent the morning shopping for groceries, picking up prescriptions, and laughing over coffee. Maya treasured these moments, far removed from the intense scrutiny and demands of her career. But the day's serenity shattered when they reached the pharmacy at the edge of town. Maya had parked her car in what she thought was a valid spot, marked with ambiguous signs about towing regulations. The lot was nearly empty, so she figured it wouldn't be an issue. Leaving her mother inside the car with the windows cracked, she ran into the pharmacy to grab a prescription. It took longer than expected, an issue with insurance, a distracted pharmacist, but when she finally returned, the car was gone. Her mother, a diabetic with limited mobility, had been left stranded on the sidewalk. Panicking, Maya called for help from passers-by and eventually hailed a cab to get her mother safely home. With her mother cared for, Maya set out to locate her car. It didn't take long to track it to a nearby impound lot. Fuming but composed, she walked several blocks to the police station to report what she believed to be an unlawful towing and to seek assistance in retrieving her vehicle. The station was modest, its beige walls and fluorescent lights giving it an air of tired bureaucracy. Maya approached the front desk, where a young officer glanced up from his paperwork with disinterest. His name tag read, Officer Gregson, though everyone seemed to call him Greg. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that bore the weariness of someone who had grown complacent in his authority. Maya explained her situation calmly, her voice steady but firm. She detailed the confusing signage, her mother's vulnerability, and her urgency to recover the vehicle. Greg listened with a faint smirk, leaning back in his chair as though she were recounting an amusing anecdote rather than a genuine concern. "Ma'am," he interrupted, holding up a hand, "you parked in a restricted zone. That's not our problem. Maybe next time, pay attention to the signs." Maya blinked, momentarily stunned by his dismissive tone. "Officer, I'm trying to tell you that the signs were unclear, and I have evidence to support my case." "My mother." "Lady," Greg said, louder this time, cutting her off, "you're not the first person to come in here with some sob story about a towed car. And let me guess, you want me to wave a magic wand and fix everything?" A few other officers glanced over from their desks, some chuckling softly. Maya's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I'm asking you to do your job," she said, her tone sharpening. "If you can't assist me, then direct me to someone who can." Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You know, attitude like that isn't gonna get you far. Maybe take a deep breath and try again." Maya felt the heat rise in her cheeks but refused to let him see her anger. She reached into her bag, pulling out a file with photographs of the parking lot and the signs in question. "Here," she said, placing them on the desk. "These clearly show how misleading the signage is. I'd like to file a formal complaint." Greg glanced at the photos without much interest. He picked one up, studied it briefly, and then set it back down. "You can file all the complaints you want, lady. Doesn't change the fact that your car's at the impound lot, and you're gonna have to pay to get it out." At this point, a small crowd had gathered. A few civilians waiting for assistance watched the exchange with curiosity. One young woman discreetly began recording the interaction on her phone. Maya straightened her posture, her voice calm but commanding. "Officer, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for due process. If you continue to dismiss me, you'll regret it." Greg let out a laugh, loud and derisive. "Regret it? What are you gonna do, call the mayor? Sue me?" He turned to one of his colleagues. "She thinks she's gonna teach me a lesson." The laughter stung, but Maya remained resolute. "You don't know who I am," she said, her tone low but firm. "And that's why you're acting like this. I assure you, Officer Gregson, you will find out." Greg waved her off. "All right, ma'am, I think we're done here. Have a great day." Maya didn't move. She locked eyes with him, her gaze unwavering. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. Finally, she gathered her belongings and turned to leave, her steps deliberate and measured. As she exited the station, Greg called out after her. "Good luck with that complaint, ma'am. Hope it works out for ya." His voice was thick with mockery. Maya didn't respond. She pushed open the door, the afternoon sunlight flooding her vision. But behind her calm exterior, a storm was brewing. The sun was dipping lower in the sky as Maya walked briskly back toward her mother's house. Her heart was pounding, a mixture of anger and resolve fueling each step. She couldn't let the events at the police station slide, not because of her own pride, but because she knew the stakes were far greater. Incidents like this happened daily to people who didn't have the resources, knowledge, or power to fight back. She had seen it too often in court, where those without privilege were steamrolled by the system, their voices silenced by dismissive authority figures like Officer Gregg. As she reached her mother's small, well-kept home on the quiet suburban street, she paused at the door to compose herself. Her mother, Margaret, had always been her anchor, a source of wisdom and strength. The last thing Maya wanted was to worry her. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Margaret was seated in her favorite armchair, a knitted blanket over her legs and a cup of tea in her hands. Despite her age and frailty, there was a sharpness in her eyes that belied her years. She looked up as Maya entered, her expression immediately shifting from calm to concern. "What happened?" Margaret asked, setting her cup down on the side table. "You look like you've been in a fight." Maya gave a weary smile and sat on the couch across from her mother. "Not a fight, exactly," she said, her voice heavy with frustration. "But I did just go 10 rounds with a brick wall in the form of a police officer." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Tell me everything." As Maya recounted the encounter at the police station, her mother listened intently, her expression shifting from disapproval to outright indignation. When Maya finished, Margaret shook her head. "That man didn't just disrespect you," Margaret said. "He disrespected every person who walks into that station needing help. You can't let him get away with it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot." "I don't intend to," Maya replied. "But I need to be smart about how I approach this. If I go in guns blazing, I'll just look like another angry black woman to them. I need to make a point they can't ignore." Margaret nodded, her lips pursed. "You've always been good at that, making people listen. But don't forget, you've got more power than they realize. Use it." Maya spent the rest of the evening planning her next steps. She knew that going after Greg directly wouldn't be enough. The problem was bigger than one rude officer. This was about systemic issues, about ensuring accountability and fairness in a system that too often lacked both. The first thing she did was pull up the city's municipal codes regarding towing and parking enforcement. As a federal judge, Maya was no stranger to legal research, and she quickly found several inconsistencies in the signage regulations for the lot where her car had been towed. Armed with this information, she drafted a formal complaint to the police department, citing specific violations and demanding a review of their towing policies. Next, she reached out to a few trusted colleagues, fellow judges, lawyers, and community advocates, who she knew would stand behind her. She explained the situation in detail, emphasizing the need to address not just her personal experience but the broader issues it represented. One of her colleagues suggested contacting a local journalist known for exposing corruption and abuses of power. By the time Maya went to bed that night, she had a clear plan of action. But even with her determination, sleep didn't come easily. She couldn't shake the memory of Greg's mocking laughter or the way he had dismissed her so casually. It wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had been dismissed, ignored, or belittled because they didn't fit a certain image of respectability. The next morning, Maya's phone buzzed with a flurry of messages. One of her colleagues had leaked the story to a local news outlet, and the headline was already making waves: Federal Judge Challenges Police Misconduct After Humiliating Encounter. The article described the events at the station, carefully omitting Maya's name at her request, and included an analysis of the city's flawed towing regulations. Within hours, the story had gone viral. Social media exploded with reactions, many expressing outrage at the officer's behavior. Hashtags like #AccountabilityNow and #JusticeForAll began trending locally. People shared their own stories of mistreatment by the police, creating a groundswell of support for Maya's cause. But the backlash wasn't entirely positive. Predictably, there were those who criticized Maya for overreacting or accused her of using her position to bully the police. Others dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding, downplaying the racial and gender dynamics at play. Greg, meanwhile, was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He had started his day as usual, joking with his colleagues over coffee and handling routine calls. It wasn't until a fellow officer showed him the news article that he realized the gravity of the situation. His initial reaction was disbelief, followed by anger. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered, pacing the break room. "Going to the media like this? Blowing everything out of proportion." His supervisor, Lieutenant Harris, wasn't as dismissive. Harris was a seasoned officer who had seen his fair share of controversies, and he recognized the potential fallout from this one. He called Greg into his office for a private meeting, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "Greg," Harris began, "this is bad. Real bad. The department's already getting calls from the mayor's office, and the chief's demanding a full report. You need to tell me exactly what happened." Greg bristled but recounted the encounter with Maya, downplaying his behavior and framing her as overly emotional and difficult. Harris listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Greg finished, Harris leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You screwed up," Harris said bluntly. "And if half of what she's saying is true, you're going to be the poster boy for everything wrong with this department." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Harris held up a hand. "Save it. For now, I suggest you lay low and let us handle the fallout. And for God's sake, don't say anything to the press." As Greg left the office, his confidence wavered for the first time. The realization that this situation could spiral out of control began to sink in. Meanwhile, Maya was preparing for her next move. She had scheduled a meeting with the police chief and the city council to present her findings and demand accountability. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for systemic change. The stage was set, and the stakes were higher than ever. What had started as a simple errand on an ordinary day had become a battle for justice that would test Maya's resolve and shake the community to its core. But she was ready. She had always been ready. The conference room in City Hall was packed. The city council, local journalists, community leaders, and concerned citizens filled every chair, while others lined the walls, waiting to see how the escalating controversy would unfold. Maya sat near the front, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions brewing inside. To her left was her attorney and longtime friend, Marcus, a sharp-witted man known for his unwavering commitment to justice. To her right sat Vivian, a community activist who had rallied significant public support over the past few days. Across the room, Police Chief Harold Bennett entered, flanked by several officers, including Lieutenant Harris. Greg was conspicuously absent, a detail not lost on the attendees. Bennett, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weary expression, carried the weight of the department's reputation on his shoulders. He had been briefed on the incident and its fallout, and he knew this meeting was more than just a formality, it was a battle for public trust. The meeting began with the city council chair, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, calling for order. She summarized the purpose of the gathering: to address the allegations against Officer Gregson, examine the police department's towing and complaint handling procedures, and discuss potential reforms. Linda then turned the floor over to Maya. Maya rose from her seat, her presence commanding immediate attention. She took a moment to scan the room, ensuring every eye was on her. Then she began, her voice steady and clear. "Good evening," she said. "I stand before you not as a federal judge, but as a citizen of this city, a citizen who believes in justice, fairness, and accountability. My experience with Officer Gregson was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger issue that affects countless people in our community every day." She recounted her story with precision, leaving out no detail. She described her mother's vulnerability, the unclear signage, and the dismissive treatment she received at the station. She emphasized how such behavior erodes public trust and disproportionately impacts marginalized groups. "I'm not here seeking personal retribution," Maya continued. "I'm here because this is bigger than me. It's about ensuring that no one else is treated with the same disregard and disrespect I experienced." She then presented the evidence she had gathered: photographs of the misleading parking signs, records of similar complaints against the police department, and data showing disparities in how towing regulations were enforced. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. When she finished, Chief Bennett stood to respond. He began with an apology, acknowledging that Maya's experience was unacceptable and pledging to conduct a thorough investigation. But as he spoke, it became clear that his words were carefully measured, designed to appease without admitting too much fault. "We take these allegations seriously," Bennett said. "Officer Gregson's behavior is under review, and we are committed to ensuring that our officers uphold the highest standards of professionalism." Maya listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Bennett finished, she raised her hand. Linda nodded, granting her the floor again. "With all due respect, Chief Bennett," Maya said, "a review is not enough. Words are not enough. The community deserves action, concrete, measurable steps to address these systemic issues. What specific changes are you prepared to implement to ensure this doesn't happen again?" The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Bennett hesitated, clearly unprepared for the direct challenge. He glanced at Harris, who gave a small nod before stepping forward. "Judge Roberts," Harris said, addressing Maya formally, "you've made valid points, and we acknowledge the need for improvement. Effective immediately, we will revise our towing policies to ensure clear signage and fair enforcement. Additionally, we will conduct mandatory bias training for all officers." Maya remained composed but unimpressed. "That's a start," she said. "But it doesn't address the accountability of individual officers. What about Officer Gregson? Will there be disciplinary action?" Harris shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, Linda interjected. "That's a fair question. Chief Bennett, can you clarify the department's stance on Officer Gregson's conduct?" Bennett cleared his throat. "Officer Gregson has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. We will take appropriate action based on the findings." The room buzzed with mixed reactions, some relieved, others skeptical. Maya, however, wasn't finished. "Administrative leave," she said, her tone calm but cutting, "is not accountability. It's a paid vacation. The community deserves more than a symbolic gesture. They deserve justice." As the tension in the room reached its peak, Vivian stood to speak. Maya is right, she said, her voice filled with passion. This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows behavior like his to persist. We need independent oversight, a civilian review board to hold the police accountable. Without that, any promises of reform are meaningless. Her words ignited the room. People began voicing their support, calling for greater transparency and accountability. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the pressure they were under. Amid the commotion, a journalist raised her hand and was acknowledged by Linda. Chief Bennett, the journalist asked, how do you respond to allegations that Officer Gregson has a history of complaints against him? And why weren't those complaints addressed sooner? The question landed like a bombshell. Bennett's face tightened, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then he replied, I can't comment on personnel matters during an ongoing investigation. However, we are reviewing all past complaints to ensure appropriate actions were taken. Maya leaned forward, seizing the moment. This is exactly why we need transparency, she said. If past complaints were ignored or mishandled, that's a failure of leadership. And it's the community that pays the price. By the time the meeting concluded, it was clear that the issue wasn't going away. The city council pledged to form a task force to address police accountability and towing regulations, and the community vowed to keep the pressure on. As Maya left the building, she was met with a crowd of supporters who had gathered outside, holding signs and chanting for justice. She felt a swell of gratitude and resolve. This fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. Unbeknownst to her, Greg was watching the news coverage from his small apartment, his confidence eroding with every word. He had underestimated Maya and the power of a community united by a shared cause. For the first time, he began to understand the gravity of his actions, and the storm he had unleashed. The days following the City Hall meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Maya's life had transformed into a series of interviews, strategy sessions, and community events. The story had grown beyond the local level, drawing attention from national media outlets. Prominent civil rights organizations reached out, offering their support and amplifying the call for police reform. Maya welcomed the assistance, but she also knew the battle was far from over. Real change required more than headlines and public outrage, it demanded persistence and unwavering focus. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the controversy, Officer Gregson, Greg, was grappling with the consequences of his actions. His administrative leave had quickly turned from a reprieve to a punishment as he became the subject of intense public scrutiny. Neighbors avoided him, former friends distanced themselves, and his social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. He felt cornered, and for the first time in his career, he began to question the decisions that had led him to this point. One afternoon, Greg received an unexpected visitor at his apartment, Lieutenant Harris. Harris's expression was grim as he entered, waving off Greg's awkward attempt at hospitality. Greg, Harris began, sitting heavily in a chair, you've got to understand something. This isn't going to blow over. What happened with Judge Roberts, it's exposed a lot of issues people have been complaining about for years. You've become the face of it. Greg bristled. I didn't do anything different than what we've always done. That's the problem, Harris said bluntly. What we've always done isn't working anymore. People are angry, and they have a right to be. You treated her like she didn't matter, and now you're paying the price. Greg sat in silence, his defensiveness crumbling under Harris's words. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he had been wrong, not just in how he handled Maya, but in how he approached his role as a police officer. Is there anything I can do to fix this? Greg asked quietly. Harris sighed. That's not up to me. But if you really want to make things right, you'll need to own up to your mistakes and be willing to change. It's not going to be easy. The conversation weighed heavily on Greg. That night, he stayed up late, revisiting the events at the police station in his mind. He thought about Maya's frustration, her courage in standing up to him, and the overwhelming support she had garnered from the community. He realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for something bigger. And he had been standing in her way. While Greg wrestled with his conscience, Maya was busy preparing for a community town hall. The event had been organized by Vivian and other local activists to keep the momentum going and ensure the public remained engaged. The turnout was even larger than expected, with people of all backgrounds filling the auditorium. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of determination and hope. Maya took the stage to thunderous applause. She began by thanking the community for their support and emphasizing the importance of collective action. "This fight isn't about me," she said. "It's about us, about creating a system that works for everyone, not just a privileged few. Change doesn't happen overnight, but together, we can make it happen." As she spoke, Maya noticed a figure standing near the back of the room, partially obscured by the crowd. It was Greg. He had entered quietly, dressed in plain clothes, and was watching her intently. Maya's pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure, finishing her speech with a call to action. After the event ended, Greg hesitated, unsure whether to approach her. Finally, he worked up the courage and walked toward the stage, weaving through the crowd. Maya was speaking with Vivian and Marcus when she saw him coming. Her expression hardened, but she waited for him to speak. "Judge Roberts," Greg began, his voice hesitant, "can I talk to you for a moment? Privately?" Maya glanced at Vivian and Marcus, who both gave her a questioning look. She nodded slightly, and they stepped away, leaving her alone with Greg. "What do you want, Officer Gregson?" Maya asked, her tone sharp. "I came to apologize," Greg said, his gaze meeting hers. "I know I messed up, more than messed up. I disrespected you, dismissed you, and acted like you didn't matter. I see now how wrong I was, and I'm sorry." Maya studied him carefully, searching for signs of insincerity. She saw none. Still, an apology wasn't enough, not after everything that had happened. "Words are easy, Officer Gregson," she said. "What are you prepared to do to back them up?" Greg nodded, expecting the challenge. "I want to learn. To do better. I've already started meeting with some community leaders to understand their concerns. And I'd like to work with you, if you're willing, to make real changes in the department." Maya was taken aback. She hadn't expected Greg to take such a proactive approach, but she also knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But understand this, actions speak louder than words. If you're serious, you'll need to prove it, not to me, but to the people you've failed." Greg nodded, accepting her terms. As he left the auditorium, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was on the path to redemption. The following weeks saw a flurry of activity. The city council approved the formation of a civilian review board, and the police department began implementing new training programs focused on bias awareness and de-escalation techniques. Greg became actively involved, attending community meetings and listening to stories from those who had experienced similar mistreatment. Slowly, he began to earn back the trust of the community. For Maya, the journey was far from over. She continued to advocate for systemic reforms, using her platform to push for change at the state and national levels. The experience had been exhausting, but it had also reaffirmed her belief in the power of collective action. As the community began to heal, Maya reflected on the unexpected twists her journey had taken. What had started as a humiliating encounter at a police station had become a catalyst for change, not just for her, but for an entire city. And while the road ahead was still long, she knew they were on the right path. The shift in the city's atmosphere was palpable as weeks turned into months. The uproar from Maya's experience had ignited a fire in the community that could not be extinguished. Town halls became regular events, each drawing larger crowds than the last. People from all walks of life began sharing their own encounters with systemic injustice. What had initially been an isolated incident now felt like the opening chapter of a much larger story, a story of a city awakening to its flaws and demanding better. Maya threw herself into the work with unrelenting focus. Her days were filled with meetings, legal strategy sessions, and speaking engagements. By night, she meticulously prepared for court cases, balancing her professional responsibilities with her newfound role as an activist. Every step forward felt hard-earned, but Maya's resolve never wavered. She understood the stakes. This wasn't just about righting a wrong, it was about dismantling a broken system and building something better in its place. Meanwhile, Greg was undergoing a transformation of his own. The officer who had once dismissed Maya's complaint with a smirk was now a man grappling with the full weight of his actions. The decision to attend that first community town hall had been a turning point for him. He had expected hostility, and he wasn't wrong. Many attendees didn't hesitate to confront him, demanding answers for years of mistreatment. But instead of retreating, Greg listened. What he heard was a series of stories that painted a damning picture of the department he had served for over a decade. Single mothers who had been harassed for minor infractions, young men stopped repeatedly for no reason other than the color of their skin, families forced to pay exorbitant towing fees that left them financially crippled. Each account added another layer to Greg's understanding of the harm he had unwittingly been complicit in. One story, in particular, struck a chord. An elderly man named Mr. Johnson stood up during a meeting to share how his car had been towed while he was inside a pharmacy buying medication for his wife. When he explained the situation to the responding officer, he was met with the same dismissive attitude Maya had encountered. Unable to afford the towing fees, he had to sell the car, a loss that left him and his wife struggling to access critical medical care. As Mr. Johnson spoke, Greg felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't shake the realization that he had been that officer more times than he cared to admit. For the first time in his life, Greg began to see policing not as a duty to enforce the law, but as a responsibility to serve the people. Determined to make amends, Greg reached out to Vivian, the community activist who had been instrumental in organizing the town halls. She was skeptical at first, but Greg's persistence won her over. Together, they began crafting a program aimed at fostering dialogue between the police and the community. They called it Bridging the Divide, and its goal was simple: to rebuild trust through honest conversations and collaborative problem-solving. The first session of Bridging the Divide was held at a local recreation center. The turnout was modest but significant, with about 30 attendees from both sides. Greg opened the meeting with a heartfelt admission of his own failings, setting the tone for the evening. "I've made mistakes," he said. "Big ones. And I'm here because I want to learn how to do better." The vulnerability in Greg's voice caught many off guard. What followed was a raw, unfiltered discussion about the fears, frustrations, and misunderstandings that had long divided the community and its police force. By the end of the night, there were no illusions that a single meeting could solve such deeply entrenched issues. But it was a start, and for the first time in years, people on both sides left feeling hopeful. As the program gained momentum, Maya began to notice a change in Greg. She saw him at more community events, not as an observer, but as an active participant. He volunteered to help organize food drives, spoke at youth mentorship programs, and even joined a local book club to better understand the perspectives of those he had once dismissed. Maya, however, remained cautious. While she appreciated Greg's efforts, she also understood the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. During one of their conversations, she told him plainly, "You're doing good work, Greg. But redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning from it and making sure it doesn't repeat itself." Greg nodded, her words sinking deep. "I know," he said. "And I'll spend the rest of my life proving I've learned that lesson." The turning point came when Maya was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. The event, held in Washington, D.C., brought together legal experts, activists, and policymakers from across the country. Maya's speech was the highlight of the evening, drawing a standing ovation for her impassioned call to action. What no one expected was Greg stepping onto the stage afterward. He hadn't been on the program, but with Maya's permission, he took the microphone. "I'm not here as an officer tonight," Greg began, his voice steady but emotional. "I'm here as a man who's made mistakes. Judge Roberts taught me something I'll never forget, that every person who walks through those station doors deserves respect, no matter who they are. I failed to see that, and it took her courage to open my eyes. Now, it's my responsibility to carry that lesson forward." The audience was silent, captivated by his sincerity. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. As the conference wrapped up, Maya and Greg found themselves standing side by side, watching the crowd disperse. "Not bad for a guy who used to think an apology was enough," Maya said with a small smile. Greg chuckled. "Not bad for a judge who turned a parking complaint into a movement." Their journey was far from over, but at that moment, they both felt a sense of accomplishment. Together, they had taken the first steps toward transforming their city, and themselves. The story that began with a parking lot confrontation now echoed far beyond the city. News outlets framed it as an extraordinary tale of accountability and transformation, while communities nationwide watched to see how real change could unfold. Yet, amidst the public accolades and momentum, Maya knew that the hardest work was still ahead. Reform wasn't a destination, it was an ongoing struggle, requiring vigilance, sacrifice, and constant reevaluation. Back in the city, the grassroots energy continued to swell. Bridging the Divide had grown into a full-fledged initiative, with workshops, mentorship programs, and training sessions for officers and community members alike. Greg became one of the program's most vocal advocates, often volunteering to lead sessions where he openly shared his journey. His willingness to confront his own shortcomings turned him into an unlikely symbol of what genuine accountability could look like. But not everyone was ready to embrace the changes. Within the police department, there were murmurs of discontent. Some officers resented the scrutiny, feeling unfairly targeted for problems they believed were outside their control. Others dismissed Greg's transformation as performative, accusing him of pandering to public pressure. One afternoon, during a departmental meeting, the tension came to a head. "Are we really supposed to believe you've changed, Greg?" a veteran officer, Simmons, said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You're just saying what they want to hear. You think throwing us under the bus makes you some kind of hero?" Greg didn't flinch. "I'm not a hero," he replied calmly. "And I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. But we can't pretend the way we've been doing things is working. It's not. If we don't fix this, we'll lose the trust of the people we're supposed to serve." "Trust?" Simmons shot back. "What about loyalty? You're supposed to have our backs." "I do," Greg said, his voice firm. "And that's exactly why I'm doing this. Because if we don't change, we're not just failing the community, we're failing each other. This isn't about blame, it's about responsibility." The room fell silent, the weight of Greg's words hanging in the air. While some remained unconvinced, others began to see the merit in his perspective. Slowly, the department started to shift. Officers who had initially resisted the reforms began participating in workshops, engaging in difficult conversations, and reconsidering their approach to policing. For Maya, seeing this change unfold was both gratifying and bittersweet. She had poured every ounce of herself into the fight, but the relentless pace was beginning to take its toll. Vivian noticed the strain during one of their strategy meetings and pulled her aside afterward. "Maya, you need to take a break," Vivian said gently. "You've been going non-stop for months. If you burn out, what happens to everything we've built?" Maya hesitated, guilt creeping in at the thought of stepping back. "There's too much at stake, Viv. I can't just stop." "You're not stopping," Vivian said. "You're recharging. There's a difference. You've inspired so many people, let them carry the torch for a while. Trust me, the work will still be here when you're ready. Reluctantly, Maya agreed. She cleared her schedule for the first time in months and retreated to a small cabin outside the city. The quiet was jarring at first, but as the days passed, she began to rediscover a sense of peace. She spent her time hiking, journaling, and reflecting on everything that had happened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya received an unexpected call. It was Greg. "I heard you took some time off," he said. "Smart move. You deserve it." "Thanks," Maya replied. "What's going on?" "Nothing urgent," Greg said. "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. You didn't have to give me a second chance, but you did. And it changed my life." Maya smiled, though Greg couldn't see it. "You earned it," she said simply. When Maya returned to the city, she found that the movement had taken on a life of its own. New leaders had emerged, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the cause. Programs like Bridging the Divide were being replicated in neighboring towns, and the city council had passed several new measures aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the police department. One of the most profound moments came during a ceremony at City Hall, where Maya and Greg were invited to speak. The mayor, acknowledging their efforts, unveiled a plaque dedicated to the citizens who had fought for justice and reform. It was inscribed with the words, "For those who dared to believe in a better tomorrow." As Maya and Greg stood together, watching the crowd applaud, Maya felt a surge of hope. The journey had been exhausting, but it had also been transformative. She had seen firsthand what was possible when people came together, united by a shared vision of justice and equality. After the ceremony, Maya addressed the crowd one last time. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning. Change doesn't come from one person or one moment, it comes from all of us, working together, every single day. So let's keep going. Let's keep building. Let's keep believing in a better tomorrow." The applause was deafening, but it was the conversations that followed, between neighbors, friends, and even former adversaries.